Hello, I'm Simon Croom and I'm the Executive Director of the Supply Chain Management Institute here at the University of San Diego. And I have with me Professor Andrew Cox, who's a visiting professor at the Supply Chain Management Institute. Dr. Cox was previously the Director for the Centre for Business Strategy and Procurement at the University of Birmingham Business School and set up the first MBA in Strategic Procurement in Europe. So Andrew, one of the things that we're working on together and your involvement with San Diego is focusing on is this whole notion of world class. So tell me a little bit about how you see world class. What does it mean?
Another very good question. Bluntly, we think it's a moving target that nobody can achieve. That's been my view for a long time. Let me explain what I mean by that, because I think there's two concepts that you have to grasp. One is world-class practice, and the other is best practice for the industry sector that you're in. Mm-hmm. So let's just take the concept of world-class. I think most academics, probably most consultancies, agree what the theoretically ideal things are that buyers should do if you think about the whole strategic sourcing process, from identifying and segmenting your spend, through identifying the teams to work on strategies, through identifying business needs and requirements, through understanding how to do supply market and supply chain analysis, through selecting sourcing options, through contract award, tender negotiation and so on, into post-contractual relationship management and iteration to review of strategies. There's a lot of, if you read the literature that's available in the US, in Europe, around the world, there's actually a lot of consensus about what good practice looks like. Mm-hmm. Whether we're talking target costing, purchase price cost analysis, how to do RFIs and so on. Most people understand what it is. Most people understand that in certain industries there have been leading practices around long-term collaboration, supply chain management, if you prefer that phrase. And we by looking at what academics and consultants define and then looking at what operational practice there is in the real world with practitioners, you can identify, as my research group has done for 15 years now, what are all of the best practices most people would point to. The problem for most organizations is they're resource and time constrained. Mm-hmm. So that when we talk about world class, our definition would be world class is what you would do if you were resource and time unconstrained and could do the ideal. But everybody who might listen to this will say the same thing. But I don't have enough staff, I don't have enough time, the CEO doesn't understand what the value would be if I was resourced properly. All organizations are the same. They are time and resource constrained. So world class practice is something that you would aspire to. Mm-hmm. That isn't necessarily fully attainable. But some industries and sectors get closer to it than others. Now, if I asked anybody who's listening to this, name the companies that stand out, who you would say were world class, you would normally get similar names. They're coming from the automotive sector, from retail, they're coming from maybe the computer IT industry. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask yourself this question: why those companies? Is it just because the individuals in those companies are smarter than other people? Or is it because of the circumstances they're in? Mm-hmm. And I would say they operate with low margins and they're very highly outsourced as organizations for the delivery of their business models. They have to recognize that if 85 to 90% of what you do operationally is externally resourced through suppliers or through supply chains, you have to be world-class at managing or get as close as you can to them. And particularly if you're in a cost leadership business model and you make very small profits, because any improvement commercially that you can make through supply chain management immediately goes to the bottom line. So we think, I've always argued this, there is a correlation between human practice and the circumstances people are in. Mm-hmm. Certain companies have to be world-class because it's part of their strategic business model. So you can point to those. I haven't time to go through that in detail today. But if we now take the other extreme, the strategic importance of buying to a consultancy company is relatively low. They're heavily insourced for what they do as a business. They buy mainly tactical things. And although you can be world-class at what you do, or try to be, the time, resource and effort and the involvement that you'll get from the business to give you the resources to do the things that might allow you to be closer to world-class just don't normally exist because the business doesn't see any value in it.
Okay.
So you can place, I've written a number of things recently about this, you can place sectors and firms in relationship to the strategic importance of the business, and whether they will put the time and resource into doing the things that all of us in the academic world sort of agree, despite nuances, are good practice. So what do we mean by best practice?
Can I just take you on that point, because you've sort of located the world-class organisations, the retailers, the highly outsourced, and then at the other extreme, the consultancies who are not very outsourced at all. But what we're seeing is a transition of quite a lot of organisations who are increasingly outsourcing and increasingly collaborating. Aerospace and defence is a good example. Biotech is another good example. So how are they going to move from where they are today to a bit further along that journey?
Again, good question. The more that companies outsource, the more that they are required to think carefully about the relative strategic importance of the things that they've outsourced and the delivery of their operational models. So what you tend to see happening is the more that people outsource, initially they think they've outsourced their problems, but then they discover that those problems come back to bite them, as many people who've been through the outsourcing boom of late have discovered. And that then forces them, because they realise they didn't get control of it effectively and didn't manage it properly, because you can't outsource things and not manage them. You have to manage them because they're outsourced, and you have to manage them through effective supply chain management approaches. Increasingly more resource then has to be put in by the organisation to help people be better at it. So we see a correlation between the more you're outsourced, the more you have to adopt better practices. Now that said, my view is this: not everybody can do the same things. So for example, in some industries and sectors you will not be able to do the things that other industries and sectors do. Very simple example. In the benchmarking tool that I've developed, that we're working with you at San Diego to bring to the American audience, to see if they can assess whether they think they're getting close to world class or perhaps best in class in their industry and sector, one of the questions we ask is it possible for you to develop demand and capacity planning for 5 years to give your suppliers demand signals, volume signals, that will allow them to optimize their business model as a supplier? Now we know that in certain industries, the process industries, continuous volume and demand, high degrees of certainty, it is possible, don't always have to do it, but it is possible for buyers to make decisions to collaborate with suppliers and provide those signals. You work in the construction industry and you're doing one-off projects where the design and specification and requirement will never be the same. You can't do it. That doesn't mean the people in the construction industry are incompetent. It means that the structural demand and supply circumstances that they have to manage are not conducive to certain types of practice.
So it's a different world in which to be world class, really.
Well, I think that's why we use the distinction between world class and best in class. What I've done with the benchmarking approach that we're going to work with you at San Diego and we're using in Europe and the UK is to say to organisations, try and understand where you sit against what the best of the best is. And actually that's a moving target, because one of the things we haven't mentioned is the importance of technology. Increasingly that world-class target moves because the technological capability of doing things online will move and move and move, and we'll have more advanced ways of doing things. So world-class isn't fixed, it moves. But not everybody will be able to do the same things. So that what you need to understand is two things. How close am I to the ideal, as it's currently understood technologically, against what economists call X-efficiency, the best we could do given current technology, ways of doing things. But then in an industrial sector, so let's say you're in consulting, or you're in banking, or you're in contract manufacture, or you're in services, or in the public sector, how do you compare with organisations who are in your industry and sector? So one of the things that we're going to allow people to do working with us at San Diego is you'll be able to benchmark yourself online now, very quickly, by doing a self-assessment. How do I compare against people who the best of the best, against the ideal? How do I compare against the best of the people who are in the database? How do I compare against people in my sector? And then if I want to understand by size or type of organisation, how do I compare with the best in those industries? So distinction between best in class, but you have to start with understanding what the ideal is. So that's why we make the distinction. World class is an unattainable ideal because no organisation in the world is not resource and time constrained. I looked at Toyota, seen what they do. They're not world class in everything.
True. Thank you.
Pleasure.